December 1944. Somewhere along a frozen road on the Western Front. No one knows who took this photograph. It was discovered decades later in a rusted tin box, and historians still argue about what was really happening in this moment. But what unsettles them most is not the snow, nor the ruined village behind the column of soldiers. It's the people in the frame. A young soldier carries a collapsed woman on his back, his expression caught between fear and determination. A little girl walks beside him, eyes wide as if watching something just outside the camera's view, and behind them, a line of armed men pushes forward with urgent steps, almost as if they are fleeing from something. So the questions remain. Who were these people? Why was a soldier risking his life to save a woman who wasn't his ally, and what happened minutes after this photograph was taken? The truth behind this image is darker and more beautiful than anyone expects. December 1944, Central Texas, a frozen field outside Camp Hearn. The wind came first, sharp, needling, cutting through the thin government-issue coats worn by the 20 German women marching across a winter-bleached pasture. Ice crusted along the edges of the grass, snapping beneath their boots with every step. Above them, the sky spread wide and pale, the kind of Texas gray that seemed to drain warmth straight out of the bones. Helga Bauer, 32, walked near the center of the line, leaning forward against the wind as if her body could no longer remember how to hold itself upright. She had been unsteady all morning, her breath shallow, her steps dragging. The guards, a handful of young American soldiers barely older than boys, kept watch but said little. Their routine was simple: escort the prisoners to the rancher's pasture, supervise the labor, bring them back by sundown. But on this morning, the routine shattered. Helga's knees buckled without warning. One moment she was upright, the next she collapsed soundlessly into the frost, her hands splaying into the frozen dirt as if reaching for something she could not name. The fall was so sudden that the line of women behind her stumbled to avoid tripping over her body. A thin, piercing scream tore across the field. "Mama! Mama!" 9-year-old Liesel threw herself onto the ground beside her mother, grabbing at her shoulders, shaking her, her small voice cracking under the weight of terror. Helga did not move. Her eyes were half open, unfocused, the color drained from her lips. Cold steamed from her breath in an unsteady, weakening rhythm. The German women froze, their instincts trained by years of propaganda. They expected shouting, rifles raised, punishment for slowing the line. But none of that came. What happened instead was the kind of moment none of them had ever imagined, something so violently at odds with everything they had been taught that it struck them harder than the winter wind. 2 American soldiers sprinted forward. Not with rifles, not with anger, not with suspicion, with fear. Fear for her. Private Thomas Avery dropped to his knees on one side of Helga, brushing ice from her face, checking her pulse with shaking fingers. Corporal Jack Turner crouched on the other side, pulling off his own gloves to warm her hands between his palms. "Her skin's like stone," Turner muttered. "We've got to move her, now." Before Liesel could even understand what was happening, Turner slid one arm under Helga's shoulders. Avery lifted her legs, and together, without hesitation, they raised the German woman into their arms. Not roughly, not mechanically, but the way a family member lifts someone they love. Liesel scrambled up, her breath hitching as she ran after them, boots slipping on the ice. "Why are you carrying my mother? Where are you taking her?" Her voice cracked the air like a whip. Fear, confusion, and disbelief knotted together. The women behind her watched, stunned into silence. The only sound was the crunch of boots and the howl of the winter wind as the Americans carried Helga toward the distant storage barn that had been outfitted with a stove for warming breaks. No one shouted at Liesel to stay back. No one threatened her. No one treated the unconscious woman as an enemy. The sight was almost unbearable. 2 U.S. soldiers running across a frozen Texas field with a limp German prisoner held gently between them, while her daughter chased behind, begging for answers. In that moment, something impossible hung in the air, a contradiction so stark it rattled every prisoner who witnessed it. Why would the enemy do this? Why would soldiers in the middle of a world war risk themselves for a woman who had once worn the uniform of the Reich? Behind them, the prisoners exchanged looks heavy with unspoken fear. Everything they had been told about Americans, cruel, merciless, barbaric, began to flicker, uncertain, as if the lies were struggling to hold against the evidence of their own eyes. And somewhere above the rattling wind, the broader truth of the moment lingered like a quiet echo. It was December 1944. American boys were fighting in Belgium, in the Philippines, in the skies over Germany. Factories in Iowa, Ohio, and Texas roared night and day, feeding the might of the Allied war machine. Yet here in a frozen Texas field, with the world still burning, those same Americans still chose to lift an enemy with their own hands, because suffering, to them, was not something to be ignored. Even in war, the greatest generation carried more than rifles. They carried their humanity. The fear did not begin in Texas. It had been planted long before, across an ocean, under skies choked with smoke, in a city where windows rattled nightly from the thunder of Allied bombers. Helga Bauer had once lived in a narrow brick apartment above a bakery in Hamburg, a place that smelled of yeast and warm bread in the early mornings. Before the war, she'd walked Liesel to school along streets lined with chestnut trees. Children chalked hopscotch squares on the cobblestones, and the ships in the Elbe River blew their horns at dusk. Life had been small, ordinary, full of rhythms she thought would last forever. But by 1943, Hamburg was no longer a city. It was a target. Operation Gomorrah had torn it apart. Night after night, British and American bombers poured fire over neighborhoods that had stood for centuries. Helga remembered the heat more than the sound, the suffocating rush of air as firestorms roared between the buildings. She remembered clutching Liesel against her chest in a basement shelter as the world above them shrieked and cracked. She remembered the morning after, climbing out of the cellar into streets where shadows were burned into walls and people moved like ghosts through ash. Food grew scarce. Medicine grew scarcer. Hospitals overflowed with the wounded and the dying. In those final war years, Germany had become a place where mothers rationed their own breaths so their children might eat another day, where the sick were left along roadsides because there were no doctors left to treat them, where a woman collapsing from hunger or cold could lie for hours, untouched, because everyone was too weak, too afraid, or too broken to stop. By late 1944, Helga and Liesel were part of the silent tide of refugees moving through northern Germany, families pushing carts of belongings, soldiers retreating from the Eastern Front, widows holding hands with children who no longer spoke. The collapse of order meant the collapse of mercy. The strong moved forward, the weak were simply left behind. It was in this chaos that Helga and Liesel were captured, not in battle, not in some dramatic confrontation, simply swept up by American infantry clearing out a rural crossroads where German units had abandoned their posts. A U.S. officer, seeing dozens of civilians mixed with auxiliary personnel, ordered everyone transported to a processing station. There was no time to separate combatants from refugees, mothers from daughters. The war was moving too quickly, and so Helga and her 9-year-old girl became POWs by accident. 2 names on a manifest of exhausted people herded onto a military truck. On that transport, the seeds of fear took full root. A German sergeant, captured earlier, whispered through clenched teeth, "Americans hate your children." An older woman murmured, "The weak ones are disposed first, too expensive to feed." Another added, trembling, "Americans are barbarians with no honor. They smile as they kill." These were not official orders, not written threats, but rumors spoken in darkness have a way of sounding like truth. The Reich had spent years cultivating such belief. Posters showed American soldiers as monsters with exaggerated jaws. Leaflets claimed the enemy experimented on prisoners. Radio broadcasts warned women that Americans would tear families apart. To a terrified mother and a child who had never seen an American in her life, the propaganda clung to their skin like soot. By the time their ship crossed the Atlantic and the train carried them deep into Texas, fear had hardened into certainty. Every time a guard raised his voice, even just to give instructions, Liesel flinched and grabbed her mother's hand. Every time Helga coughed, she wondered if the rumor was true, that the sick were useless and therefore unwanted. Which is why, on that frozen morning in Camp Hearn, when Helga collapsed in the field, the terror inside her daughter erupted like a breaking dam. Liesel's scream had not been merely fear of losing her mother. It had been fear of what the Americans would do now that her mother had fallen, a fear carved into her by months of hunger, flight, and whispered warnings. "Why are you carrying my mother? Where are you taking her?" To Liesel's ears, the answer was obvious, because German propaganda had already filled in the blanks. They were taking her away, to punish her, to dispose of her, to separate them forever. That was the world Liesel came from, a world where kindness was rare, where survival meant bracing for the worst, where strangers did not help unless they wanted something in return. But Texas, in late 1944, was not Germany. Across the Atlantic, America stood untouched by bombs. No cities reduced to cinders. No millions fleeing through ruins. No food lines stretching around blocks. Instead, the nation hummed with production so vast it defied imagination. 96,000 aircraft a year, thousands of tanks and trucks rolling off assembly lines. 8 million tons of shipping built in a single year. Fields of wheat and corn stretching farther than most Europeans had ever seen. Cattle herds large enough to feed armies. It was a country with so much abundance that even its prisoners ate better than many civilians in Europe. Even in war, an American chaplain once wrote home, "America has enough to feed its enemies." To many Americans, it wasn't remarkable. It was simply what decent people did. They believed that victory meant nothing if they lost their humanity along the way. Mothers in Iowa knitted scarves for POWs. Churches in Oklahoma collected winter coats for camps. Ranchers in Texas sent fresh beef to compounds holding the very men their sons were fighting overseas. This was the world Helga and Liesel had stepped into, though they did not know it yet, a world whose values were so different from the war-torn continent they came from that the kindness of American soldiers felt dangerous, impossible even. And so, as Liesel chased after the 2 soldiers carrying her unconscious mother, her boots slipping on the ice, her breath forming frantic clouds in the air, she ran not only from fear of loss, but from the crushing weight of everything she had been told, everything she had believed, everything she thought the enemy was capable of. Behind her, the other German women watched with wide, hollow eyes, each of them caught between 2 realities: the brutal world they had fled, and the bewildering world unfolding before them in this unlikely place in the middle of a quiet Texas pasture, under a sky untouched by war, a place where the enemy ran, not to harm a helpless woman, but to save her. The barn the soldiers carried Helga toward was nothing grand, just a converted storage shed with a potbelly stove glowing in the corner and wooden crates stacked along the walls. But to the freezing German women huddled at the doorway, it looked like a sanctuary. The warmth hit them the moment they stepped inside, a wave of heat that softened the sting in their hands and brought color back to their cheeks. Private Avery lowered Helga gently onto a pile of folded horse blankets, his breathing uneven not from exertion but from worry. Turner knelt beside him, tugging off his coat and draping it over her body. Helga didn't stir. Her lips were still pale, her eyelids flickering with faint tremors. "Pulse is weak," Avery muttered. "Hands are like ice." Turner rose, crossed the barn in 3 strides, and returned with a tin cup already steaming. He pressed it into Liesel's shaking hands. "Here, sweetheart. Cocoa. Hold it for her." Liesel looked up at him, startled by the gentleness in his voice. The cup wobbled in her hands as she kneeled beside her mother, steam drifting upward and fogging her eyes. Avery rubbed Helga's arms briskly, trying to stir circulation, while Turner massaged her fingers, blowing warm air into his palms before cupping hers again. The 2 men worked in quiet coordination, their movements practiced, instinctive. Soldiers who'd seen enough suffering to know how to respond without needing orders. One of the German women whispered from the doorway, "Warum berühren Sie sie so? Why are they touching her like that?" Another answered shakily, "They're trying to help her." A third shook her head. "No, it must be a trick." But even as she said it, she couldn't tear her gaze away from the sight before her. 2 Americans kneeling on a dirt-strewn floor, warming an unconscious enemy as though she were one of their own. Liesel clutched the cocoa tighter. Her voice came out small, trembling. Is she dying?" Turner paused, looked her directly in the eyes, and said with a calmness that settled over her like a blanket, "Your mother is safe. We don't hurt sick people." The words landed with the weight of a miracle. Liesel blinked, stunned. Safe? In a place like this? Among men her teachers had called savages? Avery leaned close to Helga and lifted her eyelid, checking her pupil response, then whispered, "Come on, ma'am. Stay with us." He reached for Liesel's hand. "Can you hold her head up a bit for me?" "Good girl. That's it." The trust in his tone, so casual and unforced, made Liesel's throat tighten. No adult had spoken to her that gently since her father died in the bombings. The other German women edged closer, warmth from the stove drawing them in. They exchanged glances of disbelief. "They're giving her their coats," one murmured. "Look, he's blowing on her hands. No one in Germany would do this for us. Not anymore." It was true. In the Germany they had fled, compassion had become a scarce commodity, trampled beneath the boots of fear and survival. But here in the shabby Texas barn it blossomed like something sacred. Turner glanced over his shoulder. "Avery, grab the Red Cross kit." Avery stood, crossed the barn, and returned carrying a metal tin painted with a red cross. Inside were bandages, smelling salts, small vials of medicine, bars of soap stamped U.S. Army, and, most precious of all, ration chocolate. Liesel stared at the chocolate, eyes widening. She hadn't seen real chocolate in 2 years. Turner snapped a piece off, broke it smaller, and held the fragment to Helga's lips after warming it between his fingers. A smear melted against her mouth, and her throat twitched in a faint swallow. "She's responding," he said softly. "Good sign." To the German prisoners, the sight was almost unreal. A Red Cross kit, chocolate, medicine, warmth, gentle voices. None of this fit the image of Americans they had been taught to fear. One woman whispered, half to herself, "Why would they waste supplies on us?" Another answered, voice barely a breath, "Because they have enough." They did. America in 1944 had more than enough. While Germany rationed beet syrup and potato peels, the United States churned out food from fields that spanned entire horizons. Cattle roamed by the millions. Train cars loaded with flour and sugar rolled day and night from Midwest farms to coastal ports. Even the camps built to hold enemy prisoners received steady shipments of milk, canned fruit, vitamins, blankets, and winter coats. Churches in Texas sent quilts stitched by mothers and grandmothers. YMCA volunteers brought crates of books. The Red Cross delivered bandages, toothbrushes, and cocoa mix. It was a nation where compassion was not something extraordinary. It was expected. Avery glanced toward the door. "Somebody get Pastor Whitaker. He's on base today. He can help with the women." Pastor. The word floated through the air like a foreign idea. A German woman whispered, "They bring priests. For us, not priests, pastors. Representatives of an American faith rooted in mercy, charity, and the belief that every human being, even an enemy, carried the imprint of God." Turner rested a hand on Helga's forehead. "Temperature's coming up. She'll be all right." Liesel let out a sob of relief, leaning forward until her forehead touched her mother's arm. When Turner placed a steadying hand on her shoulder, she didn't flinch this time. Outside the barn, the wind howled. Across the plains, rattling the tin roof, but inside, the warmth grew thicker, filling the space with a quiet intimacy. Even the German women, initially frozen by fear, now sank onto crates or crouched beside the stove, absorbing the heat that seeped into their bones. "What kind of men are these?" one of them murmured. Another shook her head slowly. They bent down. They carried her. Our own officers would have left her where she fell." A third added, voice trembling, "They act as if she matters." The idea sounded impossible, and yet here it was, unfolding before their eyes. As the stove crackled, Turner began explaining almost casually, as though the question had been unspoken but obvious. "We follow the Geneva Convention here. Means prisoners get care, food, medical attention, same as our own folks would." He didn't say it as a boast, just a fact. But to the women listening, it struck with stunning force. Germany had signed the same convention, but years of war had eroded its adherence into dust. In many parts of Europe, prisoners were beaten, starved, marched until they collapsed. Mercy was a luxury, too costly to afford. But America, this strange, vast country untouched by bombings, had enough resources, enough stability, enough moral clarity to uphold the rules even when the enemy had not. Avery finally sat back, wiping sweat from his brow despite the cold. "She's stable." The relief in the room was palpable. Liesel looked up at him through tears. Why did you help her?" she whispered. Turner met her gaze squarely. His voice was steady, carrying the straightforward sincerity of a man raised in a nation that valued decency above vengeance. "Because your mother needed help," he said, "and because we don't leave people to suffer, not in this country." Silence settled over the barn. Not heavy, but reverent. For the German prisoners, it was the moment the world they had known cracked open. For Liesel, it was the first time in her life she saw a grown man kneel before her mother. For the American soldiers, it was simply another day of doing what they believed was right. And for anyone watching, then or now, it was a glimpse of the quiet, unshakable moral strength that defined the greatest generation. Helga's breathing grew steadier. Her color returned. Her fingers twitched within Turner's hands. And as the barn filled with the scent of cocoa and the warmth of the fire, it became clear to everyone present that something had shifted. Something irreversible. Kindness had entered the room. Not tentative, not strategic, not conditional, but full, undeniable American kindness. The kind that saves lives in a war meant to destroy them. The first thing Helga felt was warmth, the soft, steady kind that crept into her bones and coaxed her out of darkness. For a long moment, she didn't dare open her eyes. Warmth had become something foreign, almost dangerous, a sensation, her body associated with fever or hallucination. But then she heard it, a quiet sniffle, then a shaky breath. "Mama, bitte, please wake up." Helga's eyes fluttered open. The rafters of the barn ceiling swam into focus, blurred by the sting of tears. A stove crackled in the corner. Blankets covered her legs. The scent of heated cocoa drifted faintly through the air, and kneeling beside her, face blotchy, eyes swollen with grief, was Liesel. "Mama." Liesel's sob cracked as she threw her arms around her mother's neck, clutching tight as if afraid Helga might vanish if she loosened her grip even slightly. I thought you were dead." Helga's arms trembled as she reached up to embrace her daughter. The effort cost her strength, but she forced herself to hold the girl, to breathe in the scent of her hair, to murmur soothing words she barely understood herself. "It's all right, Liebchen. I'm here. I'm here." But then, as consciousness sharpened, Helga noticed something else, something wrong in the best possible way. Her wrists were free, her ankles too. No cuffs, no rope, no restraints of any kind. And the coat covering her wasn't hers. It was an American soldier's. Behind Liesel, Private Avery sat on an overturned crate, elbows resting on his knees, watching mother and daughter with quiet relief. When Helga's gaze found him, he lifted a hand in greeting. A small, unsure gesture, like someone approaching a frightened animal. "You're awake," he said softly. "Good. You scared your little girl half to death." Helga stared at him, lips parting. Her voice came out raw, fragile, uncertain. "They helped me." Avery blinked, surprised, as if the idea of not helping had never crossed his mind. He nodded. "Yes, ma'am. You were freezing. Might have gone into shock if we hadn't gotten you to warmth in time." Helga swallowed hard. Her throat felt tight, constricted around a truth too big to accept. These men, her enemies, had carried her. They had wrapped her in their own coats. They had given her cocoa, medicine, blankets. Nothing in her life had prepared her for this. A sound escaped her. A broken laugh, or perhaps a sob. She pressed a trembling hand to her mouth as tears welled again. "Why?" she whispered. "Why would you do that for me?" Avery exchanged a glance with Turner, who had just returned with another blanket. The older soldier crouched beside her, rubbing his hands together for warmth before resting one lightly on her shoulder. "Ma'am," he said simply, "my mother would want someone to help her too." The words hit harder than any explosion she had ever survived, because in that single sentence was a truth so massive, so fundamentally human, that it shattered years of propaganda in one blow. He hadn't said it to boast. He hadn't said it to shame her. It wasn't political or ideological. It was just a man, a son. Speaking of his mother. Helga's breath hitched. She covered her face with both hands, and she cried. Not the restrained crying she had perfected during years of hardship. This was a breakdown. Deep, uncontrollable, wrenching sobs that pulled at something buried far beneath her ribs. Liesel clung to her, crying too, overwhelmed by the relief, the confusion, the impossible contradiction unfolding before her. The other German women watched from the edges of the barn, faces pale with disbelief. Some pressed hands to their mouths. Some frowned as if in pain. Others began crying quietly without even realizing it. One spoke first, her voice trembling. "I saw the SS strike my father when he collapsed in Dresden. They left him in the street because he slowed the march. But these men—" She shook her head, unable to finish. Another woman, eyes rimmed with red, whispered, "Our officers would have called her weak. They would have punished her. Yet the Americans," her voice cracked, "they treat her as if she has worth." A third murmured, "They carried her like she was human." The last word lingered in the air, heavy, devastating, true. Helga wiped her face with trembling fingers. "All my life," she said, her voice hoarse, "they told us Americans were animals, barbarians, that they had no honor." Turner leaned back on his heels, resting his hands on his thighs. "We're no saints," he said quietly. "We weren't perfect before the war, and we won't be perfect after. But where I'm from, folks help each other. Church ladies bring soup when someone's sick. Neighbors chop wood for widows in winter. Nobody thinks twice about lending a hand." He gestured toward the stove, the blankets, the cocoa. "That's all this is. Just people helping people." For a moment, Helga could not speak. She felt Liesel's small hand slip into hers, warm and trembling. The barn around them blurred as tears gathered again. People helping people. The phrase sounded like something out of a distant, half-forgotten dream. A world she had once believed in, but no longer recognized. Germany had become a place where citizens pointed at one another in fear, where compassion was interpreted as weakness, where every kindness carried suspicion. The last time someone had offered Helga help, a neighbor in Hamburg giving her half a loaf of bread, he'd been arrested 2 days later for sharing supplies that were meant for the Reich. Here, men who should have hated her had treated her with more humanity than her own soldiers ever had. "America wasn't perfect," Turner continued, voice gentle. "But most of us, we try to do the right thing when we see it. My daddy used to say a country is just a bunch of people choosing how to treat one another. And you can decide to be cruel, or you can decide to be kind." He shrugged. "Kindness stuck better where I'm from." The women listened, absorbing every syllable. Outside the barn, the wind slowed, shifting from a brutal howl to a distant moan. Snowflakes drifted past the open door. The Texas plains stretched silent and endless, an unfamiliar world far removed from the smoldering ruins of Europe. And in the warmth, something subtle began to crack inside every prisoner present. For years, their worldview had been carved into them stone-hard. America was the enemy. Americans were monsters. Surrender meant humiliation or death. Yet in this barn stood 2 men who defied everything they had been taught, not with speeches, not with threats, but with cocoa, blankets, and warm hands. Helga looked up slowly, studying Turner and Avery as if seeing them for the first time. "You don't treat us like enemies," she whispered. Avery's brows lifted slightly. "Well, war says we're enemies. People don't have to." It was such a simple concept that it took the breath from her lungs. From the other women, murmurs rose. "How are we supposed to hate them when they act like this? What else have we been lied to about? If they were truly cruel, they wouldn't have saved her." The breakdown was no longer just Helga's. It was collective. It rippled through the barn like a wave, through every German woman who had survived bombings, lost homes, buried relatives, fled through ruined streets, and arrived here expecting brutality. The emotional walls they had built to survive the war, pride, suspicion, hatred, began collapsing under the weight of something they hadn't felt in years. Safety. Real safety. Given freely by the enemy. Liesel rested her head on her mother's chest, her sobs subsiding. When she finally spoke, her voice was small but steady. "Mama, they saved you." Helga kissed the top of her daughter's head. "Yes," she whispered, "they did." Turner stood, brushing straw from his knees. "Rest a while," he said. "When you feel stronger, we'll get you something warm to eat." Warm food. Rest. Care. Words that felt almost luxurious. As he stepped away, Helga called after him. "Why treat us this way, even though we are Germans?" Turner paused at the door, looking back with a quiet smile. "Ma'am," he said, "my mother taught me that helping someone doesn't depend on what uniform they once wore. A person's a person." "We weren't perfect," he added, "but we tried to do the right thing." Then he left the barn to fetch supplies. Helga lay back slowly, tears drying on her cheeks, her daughter curled against her side. She closed her eyes and breathed deeply, not in fear, not in pain, but in something approaching peace, and for the first time since the war began, she allowed herself to believe a dangerous, forbidden thought. Maybe the enemy was not the monster she had been told to fear. Maybe mercy still existed in the world. Maybe, just maybe, America was different. Around her, the German women sat in stunned silence, sharing looks that said everything words could not. The world had changed in this barn. Broken open, shifted on its axis. And nothing, absolutely nothing, they had believed before would ever look the same again. In the days that followed her collapse, Helga walked through Camp Hearn feeling as though she were learning to see again. Every corner of the compound revealed something that contradicted the world she had carried inside her, something gentler, something steadier, something she had not known she was still capable of believing in. The American guards were nothing like the monsters painted in German leaflets. In the crisp Texas mornings when the frost still clung to the edges of the barrack roofs, the soldiers gathered outside the mess hall with tin cups of coffee, trading jokes and stories from home. Their laughter was easy, unforced, rolling out into the open air like sunlight. They read letters from their mothers, their wives, their sisters. They passed around cookies wrapped in wax paper, sent from distant states, Oklahoma, Kansas, Ohio, and if a prisoner happened to be nearby, awkwardly pretending not to overhear, one of the guards might break a cookie in half and offer a piece with a simple, unguarded gesture. There was no hatred in their eyes, no contempt, no triumph. It bewildered Helga. In Germany, even civilians had begun treating one another with suspicion. Neighbors whispered behind closed shutters. The Gestapo roamed the streets like wolves, hungry for signs of disloyalty. Fear ruled everything. Fear of hunger, fear of bombardment, fear of the state, and in that frozen world, kindness had become a liability. But here, in this Texas outpost, thousands of miles from the front, the men who were supposed to be her captors spoke with a warmth she had almost forgotten existed. One morning, as she carried a bucket of laundry toward the washing station, Helga paused to watch Turner and Avery leaning against a fence, sharing a slice of cornbread one of the kitchen workers had given them. Avery tore the last bite in half and tossed it to a stray dog, who wagged its tail and trotted happily away. "Darn mutt's been hanging around the supply shed for weeks," Turner laughed. "Guess we're feeding him too well." Helga found herself smiling. A small, startled smile, but real. These were men who made room for stray dogs, for laughter, for one another, and she could not reconcile these images with the version of Americans she had been taught to fear. Liesel changed even faster. At first she kept her distance, clinging to her mother's skirt whenever a guard passed. But after her mother's collapse, something cracked inside her, something small but vital, like the hinge of a locked door giving way. Turner noticed it first. One afternoon he crouched in front of her with a scrap of cornbread wrapped in a napkin. "For you, sweetheart, fresh from the mess hall." Liesel stared at it, then at him, uncertain. Turner didn't push. He simply smiled and said, "In America, when someone gives you something nice, we say, 'Thank you. Think you could try that?'" She hesitated, glancing up at her mother. Helga nodded gently. Liesel swallowed, cheeks flushing pink. "Thank you," she whispered. Turner grinned. "There you go. That's perfect." She took the bread tentatively between her fingers and ran back to Helga, pausing halfway to turn around and wave shyly. For the rest of the day, she practiced those two words under her breath. "Thank you. Thank you. Thank you." Later that evening, when the guards distributed rations, Liesel approached Avery with half of her cornbread cupped in her hands. "For you," she said, voice trembling with both fear and pride. "Because you saved my mama." Avery blinked, startled, then he knelt to her height. "You keep it, sweetheart," he said softly. "Your mama needs you strong." But he didn't stop there. He reached into his uniform pocket and placed a peppermint candy in her palm, wrapped in crinkled white paper. Liesel stared at it as if it were a jewel. Helga felt something inside her twist painfully at the sight. Gratitude, yes, but also grief for all the years in Germany when her daughter's world had been defined only by fear. As the week went on, Helga watched the American guards more closely, trying to understand what shaped men like these, men who treated prisoners not with disdain, but with decency. She saw Turner spend an hour showing another POW how to repair a broken boot sole. She saw Avery, barely 20, offer his only pair of wool gloves to an older German man who was shivering during morning roll call. She saw guards help carry water buckets, pass out extra blankets, hold doors open for women burdened by fatigue. One morning, Helga approached Turner as he fixed a hinge on the gate. For several seconds, she simply stood there, unsure how to begin. He glanced up. "Mornin', ma'am. Feeling stronger today?" "Yes," she said softly. "Because of you." Turner wiped his hands on a rag. "Glad to hear it." Helga hesitated, then finally asked the question that had been churning in her chest since the day she'd opened her eyes in the barn. "Why help us?" Her voice cracked. "You could hate us. You could treat us as enemies. No one would blame you." Turner leaned back against the fence post, studying her with quiet sincerity. "Well," he began, "my daddy used to say that war's about governments arguing. But people? They still gotta live with themselves after it's over." He paused, eyes drifting across the horizon. "We Americans." He exhaled slowly. "We don't leave folks behind. Doesn't matter what uniform they wore. If someone's hurt, you help. That's just how we were raised." He looked back at her, the faintest smile touching the edges of his mouth. "Because we're Americans, ma'am, and Americans don't walk past suffering." Helga felt her breath hitch again. She clutched the laundry basket to her chest, absorbing the words like sunlight after a long winter. In Germany, a collapsing empire was devouring its own people. Ration cuts, forced labor, executions for defeatism. The nation she had once believed invincible was starving, burning, unraveling. Propaganda had promised her strength, unity, justice. Instead, it had given her ruins. Here in Texas, by contrast, she saw a country preparing for a different future. a prosperous, generous post-war era built on confidence rather than desperation. Even at war, America overflowed with resources. Even in pain, Americans laughed. Even in victory, they showed mercy. She felt something shift in her chest. A small, quiet understanding. Humanity was not weakness. It was strength, and America possessed it in abundance. The change spread among the other prisoners as well. Women who had once recoiled from the guards now nodded in greeting. Some even smiled hesitantly when Turner or Avery passed. One woman, Annalise, approached Avery one afternoon holding a wooden hairbrush she had repaired with wires scavenged from the workshop. "For your sister," she said shyly. "You said she has long hair, yes?" Avery stared at the gift as though it were something fragile. "Thank you," he whispered. "She'll love this." Another prisoner, once hard and defiant, approached Turner to apologize for shouting at him during the processing week. "I thought you were like the men back home," she admitted. "But you're not." Turner tipped his cap. "Apology accepted, ma'am." Cooperation followed naturally. The women worked with more care. They trusted instructions. They began to speak. Not much, but enough. And every act of kindness, every softened expression, every whispered thank you chipped away at what remained of the Reich's indoctrination. Late one evening, Helga sat on the steps of her barracks, Liesel curled against her side watching the sun dip over the plains. Turner walked past and tipped his hat. "Evening, ladies." Liesel grinned. "Good evening, Mr. Turner." He winked and continued on his way. When he disappeared from view, Helga whispered almost to herself, "I never thought I'd see my daughter smile at a soldier again." Liesel looked up at her. "Mama, are they really our enemies?" The question hung heavy in the air. Helga pulled her daughter close and kissed her forehead. "No," she said quietly. "Not here, not anymore." And as the last of the sunlight washed over the camp, Helga felt a faint but unmistakable spark of something she had not felt in years. Hope. America was not what she had been taught to fear. America was something else entirely. A place where enemies became people. Where suffering was met with compassion. Where even the defeated were treated with dignity. A place that reminded her of a truth long buried by war. Humanity could survive even the darkest times, if someone chose to protect it. And in that realization lay the awakening she had never expected. America had won her not through force, but through kindness. By the time the Texas sun returned in earnest, melting the frost from the barracks roof and softening the earth beneath the women's boots, Helga had regained much of her strength. Her cheeks no longer carried the sunken pallor of exhaustion. Her steps were steadier, her voice clearer. Each morning the camp medic stopped by to check her pulse and lungs, and each morning he offered the same warm, satisfied nod. "You're getting stronger, Mrs. Bauer. Keep it up." The words felt like small blessings. In Germany, medical attention had become a privilege few civilians received. Here, a woman who wore the wrong uniform, who spoke the wrong language, was treated as if her well-being mattered simply because she was human. Liesel flourished even more visibly. The terror that had once clung to her like shadow had loosened its grip. She now wandered freely within the designated POW area, greeting guards with shy smiles and practicing her English words. Her favorite place was the small infirmary tent, where a young American nurse named Margaret tended to minor injuries and passed out vitamins donated by local churches. One afternoon, Helga found Liesel sitting on a crate beside Margaret, gently wrapping bandages around a teddy bear the nurse kept for young relatives back home. "You're a natural." Margaret laughed, adjusting the bear's tiny arm. "I might have to make you my assistant." Liesel beamed, a lightness in her eyes Helga had not seen since before the bombings in Hamburg. "Mama," she said proudly, "Miss Margaret says I can help her tomorrow." Helga swallowed around, a tightness in her throat. "That's wonderful, Liebchen." She met Margaret's eyes and whispered, "Thank you. For everything." The nurse shook her head gently. "It's nothing. Kids should feel safe." A pause. Everyone should, really. The camp itself seemed changed, not in its rules or routines, but in its atmosphere. Something softer lingered in the air, something that could not be measured in supplies or calories. It was trust. Small at first, fragile, but unmistakable. The German women no longer stiffened when a guard approached. They asked questions. They accepted help. Some even attempted halting English greetings that made the young soldiers grin. One evening, as the women returned from a work detail repairing fences on a nearby ranch, Turner passed down the line, handing out canteens filled with lemonade. The treat had come from a care package sent by schoolchildren in Dallas, one of hundreds shipped across the country to troops and POW camps alike. "Texas sunshine in a cup," Turner joked. "Drink up." The women exchanged stunned glances, their hands tightening around the cool metal. Helga drank slowly, savoring, the tart sweetness she hadn't tasted since before the war. The shock of joy was almost painful. "Americans," Annalise murmured beside her, shaking her head. "They give lemonade to prisoners." Helga smiled softly. "Yes, they do." But it wasn't just the acts of kindness, it was the context that gave them weight. News filtered through the camp radio each evening. American soldiers were liberating towns in France and Belgium. The Allies were closing in on the heart of Germany. And yet, while fighting raged overseas, the American home front remained a world of abundance and unity. Factories ran night and day. Families saved bacon grease for the war effort. Children collected scrap metal on weekends. Farmers sent surplus milk and eggs to nearby camps. Churches knitted socks and blankets. Communities held rallies to sell war bonds. Small towns raising millions in single weekends. It was a country mobilized not only for victory, but for a vision of decency they believed worth defending. Helga felt that truth keenly each time she watched the guards gather for mail call. They read letters aloud, laughing at jokes from home, wiping at their eyes when their mothers described missing them at Sunday suppers. "We were the good guys," she overheard Avery say one evening, holding a photograph of his younger sister. "Not because we were perfect, but because we tried to be human." The simple honesty of it struck Helga with the weight of revelation. Yes, that was it. Not perfection, not righteousness, but a choice, daily, deliberate, to treat others with humanity even when the world burned around them. It was the opposite of everything she had known under the Reich, and in that contrast, the truth became impossible to ignore. America was not strong because it had more guns or more factories. America was strong because it did not let war turn it cruel. One evening, as the sky blazed orange over the Texas plains, Helga and Liesel sat outside their barracks, wrapped in donated quilts stitched by a church group from San Antonio. The patchwork squares were mismatched, uneven, some striped, some floral, some clearly cut from old shirts or dresses. Yet together they formed something warm, beautiful, whole. Liesel leaned her head on her mother's shoulder. "Mama," she whispered, "I like it here." Helga's breath caught, not in fear, but in gratitude. "I know," she murmured, stroking her daughter's hair. "I know, sweetheart." Turner approached from nearby, tipping his hat. How are you ladies doing this evening?" "Very well," Helga answered, her voice steady. "Thank you." He grinned. "Glad to hear it. Weather's warming up. Should be a good day tomorrow." Liesel perked up. "Are you going to bring more lemonade?" Turner chuckled. "We'll see what we can do." As he walked away, Helga watched him disappear into the fading light, boots crunching softly on the dry earth, shoulders relaxed, posture open and easy. Something about the image filled her with a tender ache, a longing she couldn't quite name. Was this what peace looked like, what safety felt like, what humanity could be, if only people chose it? Her mind drifted back to Germany. Streets in ruins, soldiers shouting orders, children crying from hunger. She thought of the SS officer who had struck her neighbor for begging for extra rations. She thought of how people averted their eyes from suffering because they had nothing left to give. And then she looked around this camp, in a faraway land in the middle of a war, and saw a place where decency still lived, where a young nurse let a German girl play with a teddy bear, where a soldier bent down to offer lemonade to a woman he might have been ordered to fight a year earlier, a place where enemies became, simply, people. The sun dipped lower, painting long shadows across the ground. Coyotes howled in the distance. The day cooled into a soft, pleasant dusk. In that quiet hour, as mother and daughter sat wrapped in borrowed quilts, a breeze drifted across the yard carrying the faint scent of wood smoke and wild sage. The camp lights flickered on, glowing warm against the darkening sky, and Helga felt something settle gently in her chest, something she had not dared to feel since before the war. Belonging. Not to a nation, not to a cause, but to the simple truth of shared humanity. The war might rage across oceans, empires might crumble, borders might shift, but here, in this remote patch of Texas soil, the strongest force was kindness. And for the first time in years, Helga allowed herself to believe. This, too, was a part of America. A country that was not perfect but chose, again and again, to be good. Long after Helga regained her strength, long after the chill of that December morning faded into memory, one truth remained carved into the hearts of everyone who lived through those days in Camp Hearn. The enemy had shown mercy, and that mercy had changed everything. It is impossible now, not in hindsight, not in gratitude, to ignore what kind of nation made such a moment possible. The young men who carried Helga across the frozen field were not hardened ideologues. They were farm boys from Texas and Oklahoma, welders from Ohio, clerks from Kansas. Many had never traveled more than a few miles from home before the war. They missed their mother's cooking, their small-town churches, their Friday night ball games. Yet, in the middle of a world war, they carried with them something greater than fear or hatred. They carried a sense of decency, a belief that doing the right thing still mattered, even when no one was watching. A conviction that dignity was not something a person earned, it was something they were owed. A quiet understanding passed from parent to child in barns, in church pews, in dusty one-room schools. You treat people right, even your enemies. Those young Americans didn't recite philosophy. They didn't need moral lectures. They simply acted the way their communities had raised them to act, and in doing so, they left an imprint far deeper than they ever imagined. They treated even their enemies with dignity. For Helga and Liesel, those words became a kind of anchor, proof that humanity had survived the war even when so much else had not. For thousands of German POWs across America, small acts of kindness threaded together into something enduring, something that outlasted propaganda and politics. Respect. safety, mercy. And today, decades later, their descendants still write letters of gratitude to American families whose fathers and grandfathers served as camp guards, nurses, cooks, chaplains. They speak of how a warm meal saved a starving grandfather, how a Red Cross nurse became the reason a child survived pneumonia, how a simple gesture, a blanket, a smile, a borrowed coat, became the first step in rebuilding trust after years of fear. These memories echo across generations. Not memories of violence, but of mercy. It's impossible not to compare that America, the America of the 1940s, to the one we know today. But the comparison does not need anger. It only needs honesty. There was a time when the country, though imperfect, believed deeply in the power of unity, a time when neighbors helped neighbors not because they agreed, but because they belonged to one another. A time when Americans trusted that goodness, quiet, stubborn goodness, was worth fighting for. "We weren't perfect," Turner had said, "but we tried to do the right thing." Maybe that is the message America needs now, not a critique, not a lament, a reminder. A reminder of who we used to be and who we still could be. For the strength of this nation was never measured solely in tanks or planes or battles won. The real measure was found in far humbler places. A barn warmed by a small stove, a tin cup of cocoa, a soldier kneeling to warm the hands of a woman who should have been his enemy. America's strength was never just its armies. It was its compassion. That compassion carried Helga back from the edge of collapse. It gave Liesel her first taste of safety in years. It softened the hearts of women who thought they had forgotten how to trust. It became the foundation for countless stories, some small, some profound, that would ripple through families for generations. On their last evening together in Camp Hearn, Helga and Liesel walked slowly across the yard as the sun dipped low behind the Texas plains. The light turned golden, stretching long shadows across the dust. A warm breeze carried the scent of hay and cedar. The guards at the watchtower nodded to them without suspicion, without tension, without fear. Liesel reached for her mother's hand. Helga squeezed it gently, and together they walked beneath the quiet sky, safe, unharmed, protected by the very men they once believed would destroy them. In that moment, enemy lines blurred into something softer. War became a distant echo, and mercy became the thing that endured. If there is one lesson left from their story, it is this. This is what made America great. Not just victory, but mercy.